So I guess this is the toll it's taken on taking a break, that we've lost people.
Oh,
But positively, we are the stalwarts.
There we go. Always leave it up to Steve Kinney to come up with a silver lining statement. There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
And then a little.
it's coming. There we go. See?
Okay, then. I stand corrected. I think I may have explained last time we met that both Steve and I are coming up on a period of travel. And instead of having one of us lead and the other one not be there, we kind of came up with a plan to accelerate the mode of completion of the book and to do 2 chapters at a time, so we can both be here and yet at the same time not, drag this on for more than a year. In April, I think, or in May, it'll be a year, which is
Wow.
not a bad thing. It's a good way to spend a year, isn't it? Studying the book of Acts. We're already thinking onward of what we might do after this, but now our focus is to kind of stick to the schedule that we put out. And we can always continue conversations if we don't have time to do something. Please feel free to write to me and or Steve with comments or reflections. And we can also easily build up just an email list of the people that are in the group that are coming on a regular basis or watching, catching up by watching, and share that discussion if you so wish. Sometimes people just want to talk to us directly individually, but we can do this in a communal fashion. So that's words of apologetics. Second time this morning already. Why don't we get to our text then? Steve, you want to bring us back to where we are in the whole epic story of Paul?
Yeah, so if y'all remember, Paul was trying to make his way. He had visited the churches in Macedonia and Achaia, collecting offering for the church, the community in Jerusalem. And this was both a tactical move to reconnect that fellowship and also an actual needed move as the church there was in need. And so he ends up going into the temple on the advice of James and the elders. And remember, now we're talking about James and elders and not Peter and the early missionaries. So the zeitgeist has shifted with this return to Jerusalem. He goes into the temple, he performs the Nazirite vow. Then it says the Jews from Asia. And that's the group that I've been talking about off and on, what Paul or what the New Testament letters call the Judaizers, those who believed in Jesus and yet also insisted on circumcision. And so they accused Paul of violating the law, the prophets, and for blaspheming and eventually sedition. They try to, stop him. His voice is dangerous to their community. They feel like he is a threat, and so they go after him over and over again. Long story short, he goes under the protective custody of Rome, and at that point, he's still in Jerusalem, and he goes before the Sanhedrin, and he makes his case. Last time we met, I think he retold his story of being interrupted on that Damascus road as he was going to persecute this same group of followers of the way that he now belongs to. And so basically that is kind of where we left off. And we start here with another defense of his work. And then it ends up with them sending him to Caesarea Maritima on the coastline of the Mediterranean. So David, that's all I got.
Okay, we've got Paul is well, why don't we read and see what's happening? We're mixing up a bunch of things here of which always are, who are the Jews, right? That's one of the interesting questions, and I'm sure there's a book written about the Jews in the book of Acts, right? Sometimes
Totally.
Yeah, sometimes they're the circumcised, not circumcised. So are they the Sadducees? Are they the Pharisees? Are they others? And what are the huge differences between, or the big difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees? That's going to come up today as well. But I think all in all, we're getting a description of seems to be, well, everybody is against us. And so why don't we begin reading the first paragraph and see?
Well, and one last thing, David, is that this is around 58 CE, and Nero is the emperor, and Paul has just written his last letter, as it turns out, or at least last letter that most scholars believe he wrote, the book to the letter to the church in Rome, because his goal was to bring the offering to Jerusalem and have Jerusalem, which tended to be more conservative in terms of the law, even though Paul was in their fellowship, he was hoping they would put a good word in to the church at Rome, because he had hoped to travel back to Rome and wanted to pave that way. And so suddenly he's arrested, he's thrown into jail, and here's where we pick up.
Right. And we'll remember previously also that he was in the temple area and accused of bringing a non-Jew, a Gentile, into the
Right.
area. We talked a little about where that area might have been. That's in the background. So there's the vow, the Nazarene vow. There's the bringing of the alms to from the diaspora back to the Jerusalem church, which was in need, and all is in the background. And he is arrested. So Jim, you want to begin today with reading beginning of chapter 23?
Sure. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, "Brothers, up to this day, I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Then the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. At this, Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law? And yet, in violation of the law, you ordered me to be struck?" Those standing nearby said, "Do you dare to insult God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a leader of your people.'" When
Why
Paul
don't we take a break here, because there's a few things that are kind of packed from a Jewish background point of view here. But first of all, what do we think of this particular scene, the opening salvo here of his trial, if you will? Any questions that come up or feelings, comments?
But it's curious that he didn't know that Ananias was the high priest.
Yeah, that was my thought too.
So before we get to that, let's go. Where are they at right now? It says that the Revised Standard, New Revised Standard Version has the word council here, but as Steve mentioned beforehand, what we're talking about and what's in the Greek is the Sanhedrin, the Sunhedrin. Sunhedrin means the ones who have come together to judge. Sanhedrin, as it's pronounced in Hebrew and Aramaic, it's the name of a major one of the tractates of the Talmud, all the laws of this large court. It's not clear exactly who are the judges at this particular time. It seems like, at least from this reflected here, it's kind of a coalition of judges between the different, certainly between Pharisees and Sadducees, who are up there. And so and they meet at the edge on the Temple Mount. There's an area for the Sanhedrin Temple Mount. So this has been brought to court right away. It's not that he stayed over. This is like an immediate thing. And then so the chief priest has a role in this Sanhedrin, at least the way it's described here. We get different descriptions from different times exactly how the Sanhedrin functioned. So we don't know exactly, and it didn't function just one way. I think it depended on the generation or the years and how much the Romans let them do what they wanted to do, or and so if we didn't know that he's the high priest, is that the case, or could it be that he's being sarcastic?
Yeah.
I think that Paul had poor eyesight, and that could be something of mistaken identity. But secondly, didn't you mention that this was a part of the outer court where both Jews and Gentiles stood? Could it be that the high priest didn't have the high priest attire on, and with Paul's poor eyesight, that may explain why he didn't recognize him?
It certainly could be, but I'm taking what brought me to this, the realization, to my suggestion that perhaps it's sarcasm and that he's being a little wishy-washy, is how he behaves in front of in front of Felix afterwards. So why don't we leave this up in the air? I can certainly see how that would be a traditional way of commenting it, because otherwise it makes no sense, right? How poor eyesight, and or he's not wearing his proper clothes. But if I take the whole 2 chapters into consideration, and I know we're fast forward to the end here, but I kind of reach the possibility that maybe he's being a smartass, right? Yeah. I hope that's not too.
That rings true to me. Now, is it your take, David, that the high priest is Sadducean?
Yes. Yeah. The Sadduceans, by and large, are the wealthy and the priestly classes living in the upper city, above, say, to the west of the Temple Mount. And we have archaeological evidence there of some rather lavish houses. There's a famous site called the Burnt House, and it was preserved because it was burned. And it didn't tumble, it was burned, and then it was built on or something. It's in the Jewish quarter of today. So where the Jewish quarter is today is thought to be where the Sadducees and the wealthier Jews lived. And although in the Gospels it seems to be that the major tension, certainly with the stories and certainly in Matthew, which is just where most of my recollections are, is that the problem with the early Christians was with the Pharisees more than it was with the Sadducees. But what's coming out here is that the real issue here, at least Paul in his setting this up, is it's him against the Sadducees. Hence, I would say the sarcasm and the disrespect, but also what he's going to play as far as being a Pharisee. And I'm of Pharisees. I'm the belief in resurrection of the dead, etc. Yeah. Okay, just one more comment that what do people think about the first verse where it says, brothers, up to this day I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God. Clear conscience of what?
Following the law and the prophets.
It seems to be that way. Why not say that? I just came up with something on my own. Is that the word for conscience here is sundrio, and I think there's a wordplay there with Sanhedrin, sundrian, the Sanhedrin, and the sundreo, the conscious. In any case, that's neither here nor there. Okay. And then as far as there is a law, and he said, and he's also showing off that he knows the law. That's part of what he's trying to prove here, because he's quoting from Exodus 22:28, right? You shall not speak evil, leader of your people. Okay. You want to continue, Jim? Next paragraph?
Sure. When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees group stood up and contended, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him into the barracks.
Okay.
Do you think Paul did this unintentionally? I mean, here there's Sadducees and Pharisees there, and I mean, it's almost like a ploy to divert attention from him and his trial. He's the one on trial, but you stir these guys up and they start arguing between themselves, although he's apparently in danger. But it almost sounded like he did it on purpose.
They took the bait.
I was at a meeting once, a really high-powered meeting, and I was the youngest and the most insignificant person, certainly not amongst mostly wealthy people and some highly placed academics, about the fate of an institution I was on the board of in Jerusalem, and it was being discussed in New York. The whole thing bothered me a lot, and I was pretty sure of myself. And halfway through, one of the businessmen said, "Wait a minute, I know what he's doing. He's pitting us against each other, right? I see this all the time in business." And I'm kind of smiling to myself. I said, "Hey, I didn't know I was so good at this." And I think it's certainly a tactic. I think that, to me, that's what's happening here. That's why I'm a little suspicious of Paul. I don't say in a bad way. It's survival of the way. It's survival of the way, or whether it's thought of as a sect here in this, or it's by the others in these two chapters. And I think that he's pitting them up against each other on purpose, right? Because on one hand, it is about resurrection, isn't it? It's about the idea that Jesus was resurrected. And in my mind is also the story of Lazarus in John 11, because that's scripture, at least where I'm speaking this Sunday, that some of you, I think, will be there. At the Methodist Church, and in my mind as well, this whole idea of resurrection and how it comes up, and how it's if there is resurrection, then there's legs to this whole new way, this whole new faith. If there isn't, so on one hand there's an ideology there. On the other hand, he's being very he knows his politics. That's what I think, at least. Steve, would you say that's too far-fetched, or?
No, I think that's very insightful. And as we'll see, Christology kind of drops out of these chapters. The understanding of Jesus as Christ, and now the similarity between followers of the way, the Nazarene sect, and the Pharisees is really is highlighted, and that they're not that far apart, and that Luke seems to want to defend the idea that the early church was indeed a sect within Judaism and intended to be part of that. But the wheel comes off the cart, and then that split widens by the end of this book. But it feels like there's a legitimate effort to hold it together and stay under the same.
Yeah. Okay. Terry, you want to continue?
Sure. That night, the Lord stood near him and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome." In the morning, the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who joined in this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the council must notify the tribune to bring him down to you on the pretext that you want to make a more thorough examination of his case, and we are ready to do away with him before he arrives." Go on.
Yeah, why don't we just take a little bit about this one? This is pretty interesting change here. There are some manuscripts, by the way, that instead of saying the Jews, it's some of the Jews, which is a little easier on our ears as well. It's the famous the Jews of the Gospel of John. So some of the Jews, and also, who do they go to? They're really trying, this is a group of Jews who seems like they're ingratiating themselves to the chief priest here, by doing something very priestly. Taking a vow for something to happen is discussed quite a bit in rabbinic literature. And a vow of not to eat or not to drink wine or those kind of things. It's not just the Nazarene vow, it's other vows that show how determined people are to get something done. It shows us the extent of the willingness for violence in the first century in Jerusalem, which we know from so many other sources. By the way, this is a chapter in which Josephus provides a huge amount of background, not just as to what's going on in Jerusalem, but all the shenanigans around it, all the family, who married whom in the Roman world, and who's related to who in governorships and things like that. This is just it never struck me. I knew that Josephus wasn't preserved in synagogues for much of the Middle Ages, right? There was one translation that there was an interesting reinterpretation of Josephus called Josephun, which you find in Jewish literature, at least in Europe, or maybe it's more in in Central Europe, or that was written in Hebrew, and it has many of the things that are in Josephus, but Josephus themselves, the manuscripts, were not preserved in Jewish circles. They were preserved in Christian circles. And in preparing for today's study, it struck me just how important Josephus is from a historical point to understanding books like Acts, especially. Yeah.
And David, I appreciate your pointing out the off-putting nature of that generalization, the Jews, even though we are trying our best to differentiate the different groups within Judaism, including the early Christian effort to be obedient to the law and the prophets while proclaiming Messiah and moving, into fulfillment of all that they had hoped for. But when this generalization keeps popping up 20 centuries later, it's really grievous.
It's an important reason to look at the manuscripts.
Rabbi, what with this vow they've taken? What if they fail to kill him? Does that mean they have to starve themselves to death?
I think it just means that they'll continue. They'll continue until they succeed. And it might be more of a literary thing than there was in reality, right?
No, I understand that from a literary standpoint, but if you make a vow like that, I'm not going to eat again until I murder somebody, and then you fail to murder that person, does that mean you can't? Does it just mean up until the first attempt or the second attempt, or?
I think it means until you succeed. If don't succeed, try again. Kind of.
Well, then I mean, it could take months. It could take years.
Yeah. That's the point. So if you go back to the narrative, that's exactly the point, to show their determination. I think the determination also, I think, is to ingratiate themselves to the priestly aristocracy. Yeah, and so I bring us back from a Jewish point of view to, we spoke about this, I think, in different study in the last few weeks, or maybe it was in this context. That's what Kol Nidre is about, right? That what is perceived to be the most important serious prayer of the Jewish yearly Jewish liturgy of the year is the formula which is chanted slowly by the cantor in synagogues at the eve of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Kol Nidre means all of the vows, and it goes through different languages, the vows, the promises, the different kind of things. You are now avowed, you are now annulled, they're now annulled. So one might be, with a wink in the eye, I might answer you, Richard, yeah, they keep trying, and hopefully they did it not long before Yom Kippur so they could get out of it, right? A lot of rabbinic literature has to do with how one gets out of a vow that one took. So what it tells is that people did vows, right? And that way, this is taken from some readers, listeners would identify with this. How it worked exactly, hopefully they did it the day before Yom Kippur. Okay, should we go on? Terry, go ahead, read. You read. I love the way you pronounced also when Jesus says, when the Lord says, keep up your courage. Grow up, put your big man's pants on, your adult pants on. Go ahead. We just need you to unmute yourself first.
Sorry. Now the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush, so he went and gained entrance to the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to report to him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, the prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you. The tribune took him by the hand, drew him aside privately, and asked, what is it you have to report to me? He answered, the Jews have agreed to ask to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more thoroughly into his case. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him. They have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they kill him. They are ready now and are waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, ordering him, tell no one that you have informed me of this.
Okay, the intrigue, the plot thickens, huh? Everybody's got their own insider people. This paragraph in particular reminds me of Esther and Mordecai hears of the assassination attempt, and then, gets it feels like that's kind of looming in the background. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Paul's sister, of whom I don't think we've heard about until this moment, right? Wouldn't it be great if her name was Esther? But those are my own rabbinic fantasies.
And I actually didn't remember this at all, that Paul had a sister, and obviously this would be his nephew then. I don't think I've ever remembered hearing about Paul's family.
Yeah.
Don, how about you? I'm just curious.
No, I haven't.
Yeah.
At all.
Okay. Don, you want to continue reading?
Uh,
We're at 23.
23. Then he summoned 2 of the centurions and said, get ready to leave by 9 o'clock tonight for Caesarea with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Also, provide mounts for Paul to ride and take him safely to Felix, the governor. He wrote a letter to this effect. Should I continue?
Yeah, read the letter, please. Yeah.
Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. But when I learned that he was a Roman, I came with a guard and rescued him. Since I wanted to know the charge for which they accused him, I had him brought to their council. I found that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but was charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against this man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him.
So the use of the Jews here is easier on the ears because it's Romans talking to Romans, right? It feels. In any case, why don't you go on, Don?
Okay. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him during the night to Antipatris. The next day, they let the horsemen go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he belonged to, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. Then he ordered that he be kept under guard in Herod's headquarters.
Okay, what kind of questions and reactions do we have to this last section?
I thought the soldiering was a bit over the top.
You think? Yeah.
There are 40 men who, say they want to kill Paul. And so we've got You know.
200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. I thought of it from a logistics point of view. That's a heck of a lot of just logistics, food and supplies and everything else to pull together by 9 o'clock tonight.
Oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. I was just thinking it's a bit overkill for, you know, to guard Paul.
Those Jews are pretty powerful, man. Only 40 of them.
To reinforce what you just said, the estimates of the Roman garrison in Jerusalem that there were 800 foot soldiers and 200 something else. In other words, this would have been a huge percentage of who they were, which is why I think it's safe to say that this is hyperbole, right? This is a great way of exaggerating how important keeping Paul safe was in the eyes, at least of the Romans at this stage. I don't know what other people have a different view.
No, it's reminiscent of all of the soldiers and shieldsmen and swordsmen that were involved in these in the David and Saul story. Just the huge numbers of people involved.
Right. That's how you measure the influence and the strength of a king or a political leader, right? I'm sorry, I can't resist the story. I was invited to speak once in Helsinki when I was the rabbi of Stockholm, and so I went up there, and the security guys said, you have to, as soon as you get to Helsinki, you have to connect this security guys to the Finnish Jewish community security guy. So I went to his office. It was across. I had to stay in a particular hotel where they had connections with security. Anyway, I go there and he says, "What's your schedule?" I said, "Well, my schedule is that I'm speaking tomorrow. The brothers of Taizé have asked me to make a presentation." And so this guy said, "Okay, well, I'll come with you." I said, "No, it's all right. I'll find myself a way." I said, "No, I'm coming with you." So this guy walks with me the 40 minutes or whatever it took to get to the church, this large church. We've got some needed noise here. And he proceeds to stand like this at the bottom of the stage where I was speaking from, just like, a Secret Service kind of guy, whatever. And so Brother Alois of the prior of Taizé says, "After Rabbi David, we didn't realize just how dangerous it was and how important you are that you came." I said, "I'm not. This is believe me, this has nothing to do with anything. This is these guys in their minds. This is what they want to be important." So when we think of people who have hired bodyguards today and what that says, private jets and limousines and bodyguards, I think that to me, that's what Luke is doing here as far as Paul's concerned.
I think Luke is also trying to make the case that Rome is compatible, is protecting this early emergence of the church.
Yeah. And yeah. So exactly, that's absolutely. Okay. Anything else? Okay, Herod's headquarters just happened to be a building from the past, which they were using for for this particular purpose. But I think it also says that they were treating him very well, right? They didn't throw him into a pit. They didn't throw him to he was under guard, but he was in a nice place. I think that to me, that's what the final comment makes. Very respectful of him. Seeing him.
Isn't that ancient headquarters in Caesarea Maritima, the promontory that goes out into the sea? Have you seen those ruins?
Yeah, I've been there, but I don't remember. Yeah. I don't remember. It's a beautiful site.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful area, although it's marred by a particular politician who has a palace there, whose name we won't mention today. Okay. Shall we go on? Go ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment that in my translation, it says Paul would kept under guard in Herod's palace. Doesn't say.
Yeah, I don't remember what the word is, but it's probably whatever it is. It's a nice place. I think the point is it's a nice building. Yeah. Headquarters could be palace. Yeah. Okay. And actually Herod will come up in a little bit as well for us to understand something. So who's reading? Who's next? Who's going to go next? 24:1. Megan, you reading today?
For one. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an attorney, a certain Tertullus, and they reported their case against Paul to the governor. When Paul was summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Because of you, most excellent Felix, we have long enjoyed peace, and reforms have been made for this people because of your foresight. In every way and everywhere, we welcome this with utmost gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you to hear us briefly with your customary graciousness. We have, in fact, found this man a pestilent fellow, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the world, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, so we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn from him concerning everything of which we accuse him."
Okay, so what's the tactic? What this professional lawyer, right? This professional, rhetorician, what's his tactic here?
Well, just to flatter Felix to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
And then just badmouth Paul, say he was a scoundrel.
So the word that's actually used here is pestilent, which is interesting to know in different Greek writings as well, who in these kinds of situations are called pest. And like calling somebody a rat, a dirty rat, or vermin, or whatever, or in African cultures, a cockroach, right? It's all that kind of rhetoric. And where's the direction that you think he's pulling Felix? Other than saying that he's a scoundrel, why should Felix care? Yeah, Don.
Rabbi David, I wanted to get back to Terry. I Googled Paul's sister, and there are indications that her name was Phoebe. She's mentioned in Romans, and she was a deacon when they elected female deacons.
Right.
Or elected female deacons.
So you know what I'm going to say to that? Her Greek
Yeah.
name was Phoebe, her Greek name, but her Hebrew name was Esther.
I missed that. I'm sorry.
Her Greek name may have been Phoebe, but her Hebrew name must have been Esther.
Oh, yeah. That's cool.
Right. Okay. That we do that often in the Jewish world. All of us are kind of given at birth, we're given an English name for the world and a Hebrew name, for being called up to the Torah, for marriage documents and things like that. Yeah. Okay. So it seems, yeah, go ahead, please, Jim.
Part of the tactic here, besides just buttering them up, is that you have such great foresight and everything else that it's not going to take you long, Felix. You just a couple questions of this guy, and you can make your judgment. We're beyond our way. We don't want to detain you here.
All right, you can get back to your sitting and eating being fed grapes and having palm fronds, yeah. And by the way, if you think of it, you think of Felix and the others, like they're kind of saying, "Oh God, I thought this was an easy post. I want to be out here on the water. I want to go fishing with my grandson. I want the grapes. I want the women. All the kind of things that we imagine." Again, but so he is saying, yes, it's going to be easy, but I think he's also appealing to Felix's desire to have things be quiet, because this Paul is an upstart. This Paul's going to make trouble for you. Just like he's made trouble for us, he's going to make trouble. And let's remember the first century, these decades are decades of some rather violent groups amongst the Jews that Josephus tells us about. Others, there's a lot of trouble. And what the Romans don't want is trouble, right? They want peace and quiet. They want their taxes.
They're identifying him as a zealot Jew.
Yeah,
someone who-
that's what I think is happening. Yeah.
And the dehumanizing label of calling someone vermin or pest, and also calling him an outside agitator, if you will, reminds of the powers that be that tried to keep MLK at bay, from disturbing their nest.
We see this story in history all over time and again, and taking something which is partially true. There was an issue about a Gentile being and thing, and then blowing that up. We're going to see that thread is held on to by the storyteller here as well. Like, what did he do? What exactly was the sin, the great sin that he committed, that they want to put him to death because they want to put him to death? Okay, should we go on?
Before we go on, I just want to say, this says to me that politics and politicking and campaigning hasn't changed in 2,000 years.
It's, yeah, certainly in some circles, yeah. Okay, so Richard, you get to read now.
Can you see a parallel here between the trial of Jesus and the trial of Paul?
I'll let Steve answer that.
Yeah, I think it has that resonance in several places for sure. Yeah, and I think intentionally so. The way the language is used, maybe not necessarily in this case, but in the way that the charge of sedition and blasphemy are put against him, that's the same charges against Jesus, right?
And the dynamic of the manipulating the Roman government, the Jewish forces manipulating the same fear. I look at Don, we've seen all through this book scenes and events in Paul's life which mirror scenes and events in Jesus's life, right? But the healing, the teaching, the reaching out to women, the different things, which leads me to believe that Luke here is intentionally drawing ongoing parallel between the two, because Paul is not Jesus, but Paul is still the leader of this church, right? It's still
but endowed also with the spirit of Jesus after his conversion.
Absolutely.
Even to the point of, in that first paragraph that we read, he was offering a didactic teaching to the people that were listening to him about criticizing the leaders of the priesthood.
Right. So in the same way that Jesus's life parallels in some ways Elijah's and Moses's, so Paul, I think that's very much in the literary background here.
I think that those connections are so rich to me anyhow. They do something special to my understanding and the unity of Scripture.
Your soul is joyed. Joyful for the soul. Okay, all right. So Richard, you gonna read?
Yeah, sure. The Jews also joined in the charge by asserting that all this was true. When the governor motioned to him to speak, Paul replied, "I cheerfully make my defense, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this people. As you can find out, it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They did not find me disputing with anyone in the temple or stirring up a crowd, either in the synagogues or throughout the city. Neither can they prove to you the charge that they now bring against me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. I have a hope in God, a hope that they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore, I do my best always to have a clear conscience toward God and all people. Now, after some years, I came to bring alms to my people and to offer sacrifices. While I was doing this, they found me in the temple, completing the rite of purification without any crowd or disturbance. but there were some Jews from Asia. They ought to be here before you to make an accusation, if they have anything against me. Or at least these men here tell what crimes they have found when I stood before the council, unless it was this one sentence that I called out while standing before them. It is about the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today.
Okay, so what has Paul done in this speech here? What's he accomplished?
Well, he said that there's missing witnesses.
One thing, right? It's an incomplete, missing witnesses. The accusation is incomplete. What exactly are the charges, right? We can imagine from TV programs, right? What charges are you bringing? How about vis-a-vis? Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
But he also very, very firmly affirmed, and that's double play on words, affirmed his following of the Jewish law and the prophets. You know, there's what I was doing. I was doing all the right things when they got me. You know,
Not a word about Jesus in this defense.
No, just the reference to according to the way.
Mhm. Which they derogatorily call a sect.
And his bottom line, you go, Don, go ahead.
I mean, I don't think he's making a distinction here of another tradition. I think he's firmly within the tradition
Mhm.
of his ancestors, to say it that way.
So he set this up as if he was accused, again, the narrator here is set it up that he's being accused of political sedition, I think, right? He's going to undermine this whole thing. And what Paul is saying, this isn't about politics, this is about theology. And so, Steve, he doesn't mention Jesus, but it is, I think, hinted at in the background, because what is the theological issue that he says we're talking about? I'm talking about resurrection. I don't know what you people are talking about. I'm talking about resurrection. And could that be code for, you know, for the way being, you know, centered around the resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah, I think for sure, but it also functions to once again put that wedge between Pharisees and Sadducees and try to identify with the Pharisaic tradition.
Hmm? I say absolutely, yeah. So, this is, go ahead.
I'm sorry. He does so cheerfully.
Yeah.
I mean, this defense that he's offering, you know, you could see the embers of his love for what he believes in, I think.
But I can also see him saying, "What, me? This is a theological issue. Theological issue. Me, I brought alms to," and what does he use? I brought alms to the people. The word in Greek here is the ethnos, not to the church, not to the poverty-stricken church of the way here in Jerusalem. So he's a little disingenuous here, I think. I just came to do this. Me? And that's where I got I'm influenced by this paragraph, reading it, and perhaps wrongly so, but the way that it came out to me, to go back to the first paragraph that we read, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were the chief priest. And so I in one way, I'm seeing in Paul much of the way that I did politics in my career in Israel mostly, and in Sweden. That's kind of the way that I did it. And I got a lot of laughs and I got a lot of anger because of that. And here I am in exile in Palm Springs. So we know how that worked. But that could be that I'm seeing, but to me, that's kind of what's creeping up. And of course, I don't have in my background St. Paul, right? I don't have the veneration that you folks, many of you folks, have grown up with. So hence my less than yeah.
Well, and we know that he's been encouraged by the spirit or the voice of the Lord to have confidence. You know, I've got a plan. You know, you're going to go to Rome. So, you know, so now he's just using stratagems and tactics to get through this. calling on his Roman citizenship, for example. The thing I wanted to call our attention to is the when he says, where was that? Oh yeah, verse 19. But there were some Jews from Asia. Now that's the group that undermined the church in Galatia that Paul got, and that's the group of Jewish Christian circumcisers, if you will, who have hounded him from synagogue to synagogue in the story. And so again, that distinction is important to me. It's a particular group, but when they say the Jews generally, we just it's us against them, and that's, although this mob approach that we've all kind of seen how mobs operate. It collapses distinctions, and then there's an irrational kind of self-righteous rage that takes over. But
it allows him also to, it strengthens his argument when he admits his own flaws, so to speak, his own legal issues. Yes, there may be a legal issue, but that's with those Jews from Asia. And if so, bring them here and let's talk about that. But that's nothing to do with here. In other words, you can't find somebody guilty of one thing because they may have problems in another area. Something that happens in our courts all the time, right? Or what is admissible? What can the jury hear? What can it not hear?
And I do think now, David, I hear differently that last line. It is about the resurrection of the dead, that I am on trial before you today. And that is true, right? At some deep level.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of the code for what that means to him.
Can I also say it? This sounds like a present day courtroom where the attorney butters everything up, and then cheerfully I say, I didn't do this. It's but what's interesting to me is how he does weave in the idea of the resurrection of the dead for the righteous and the unrighteous, which is his new theology in this speech. But he's saying, if anything, it's because I mentioned that, which the Romans, as you just said, were supporting. So it's a clever speech of Paul's, and it feels like a real courtroom speech.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we go on? Harold, you want to read? 22.
Okay. But Felix, who was rather well informed about the way, adjourns the hearing with the comment, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Then he ordered the centurion to keep him in custody, but to let him have some liberty and not to prevent any of his friends from taking care of his needs.
So just before this, the last scene, just is it possible? Can we expect Felix to know about the way, to be that much of a? And I think this is where Josephus does lend some support. I didn't write down the passages, but yeah, you get to know on what, and even if it's not true historically, what it proves from a literary point of view is basically giving him. Explaining why Felix says, well, Felix knows that there's more to all this than what Paul has said. And you know what? It's best just to wait. Let me put him off a bit. Well, take a stand here and get between these two groups. I want to get back to my grapes and palm branch fanning. Okay, and finally, Harold?
Some days later, when Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him speak concerning faith in Christ Jesus. And as he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became frightened and said, go away for the present. When I have an opportunity, I will send for you. At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. And for that reason, he used to send for him very often and converse with him.
It sounds like you didn't get that.
No, the same, whatever.
So no, it's actually an important part. Well, according to the narrator here, that, well, there started to be some real interesting conversations on one hand between Paul and his captor, that maybe could convince him that he's going to come on board, as well as happened at that scene in Caesar. Last time we were in Caesarea, that's what happened. What was the name of the fellow, Steve, who was converted in Caesarea? The centurion?
Oh, Cornelius.
Cornelius. So interesting, the same place, right? There's this kind of, yeah. Maybe we can, man, what that would be a catch. We can get the governor, Felix, he's going to be one of us. But then the narrator says, yeah, but that's not what Felix was about. Felix kept talking to him because he was just waiting for that bribe to come. And had Felix gotten the bribe, which comes to condemn Felix as well, then he would have been out of there. But since the bribe never came, now the last part.
Okay, after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And since he wanted to grant the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison.
Oh, as a parting gift. So
It sounded like minimum security, though.
it did sound like minimum security, except for in the meantime, he's still in jail. And in his opinion, he's done nothing wrong, right?
Yeah, and the oath takers are still on a diet.
Yeah, you're still on the oath takers. Leave it up with you. There you go. Okay. I have a question here. Why, and I don't know an answer to it. Why was he frightened when it says in verse 24 and 25, Felix became frightened? What was Felix frightened of? And I don't know the answer to that question. That's actually an innocent question on my part.
Well,
But it's a great question.
when you look at this talk about justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, if that would scare me if I was hearing that from an evangelist at that time, I would be put in fear of some future event that may take place that I'm really not in sync with.
Mhm. And yet he's waiting for the bribe. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Just by the way, Drusilla being Jewish, she was descended from Herod. I don't know if it's the Herod's granddaughter or grandniece or something. I didn't get that deep into it, but she's connected by family ties to Herod. Now, Herod is only partially Jewish. He's kind of a mixture of different, although presents himself in many ways to be Jewish. The rabbis did not approve of his Judaism in any way, and yeah, again, not my expertise, but how does that figure into this all? Other than I think it's casting aspersions on all this, that there's no justice taking place here. All this has to do with favors and who's influencing whom, and yeah, that's what I got.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'm thinking if he 2 years of this kind of, some liberty and friends taking care of his needs, Stephen, wouldn't that be the time when he wrote a lot of letters from prison? It just seems like that would have been a perfect time to write letters to all the churches.
I've often wondered when he was imprisoned in Rome, how to get all these letters out to all these other places. This would explain it, I guess.
I think he smuggled them out to people who were part of the community. Wherever they went after that, I don't know, but and maybe some were found in prison too.
Yeah.
I don't know of any scholars who make the case that he wrote letters from this imprisonment.
Okay.
There is that case for his house arrest in Rome,
Mhm.
but I don't know of it here.
Okay.
May I ask a
here.
stupid question? Oh, sorry, Jim.
Well, back in 22, you mentioned, David, a bit ago, that Felix, who was rather well informed about the way, and my thought was, if he's governor here and he's trying to keep the peace, he's got to know what all the factions are going on in his realm. And he probably was well informed. He was not a dumb governor. He understood all the stuff here, and how am I going to do? Maybe that also explains in 25. I mean, Paul's making a great defense here, and he's piling up the evidence against Felix if Felix, screws up and does him wrong here. And so Felix wants to keep the peace. Yeah, send him off. I'll call you back when I need a little more money for my grapes.
Can I ask a question? Probably silly, but are the letters of Paul, do we have the original letters of Paul?
The original
I mean, have they-
manuscripts.
The original manuscripts, are they?
No, we have copies of the original, copies of copies. Those parchments that survived and were passed on, but no, I don't know of any original, actually penned, but they were copied over and over again in many places. So we do have access to those pieces. That's that whole interesting biblical science of textual criticism, where there's verses even in this text today that are in some manuscripts but not in others. You know what I mean? So it's a science of trying to discern in cobbling together the various oral traditions and the papyri to create the gospels. Because technically no gospel has been written. This is in now 60 CE, right? And Mark's gospel, most scholars believe, was written in the 60s. And so they're in the process at this time of pulling together these pieces to tell that narrative.
Okay. I seem to remember something about the earliest pieces of manuscripts are maybe 4th or 5th century of New Testament. I don't remember exactly. And those are the questions, of course, we have for all scripture, and that goes everywhere except for Quranic scholarship. That remains highly speculative and very much off to the side as far as how the Quran came into being manuscript wise. But yeah, there's people that said that's all they do in Bible studies is they just focus on the textual aspect. Yeah, and the textual aspect doesn't mean just it's in multiple languages that it was translated into, etc. You could have a translation of a text which might be older than any example of the original of the text that we would have, or the text in its original language. Okay, folks. So we, yeah, please go ahead, Harold.
One question. I read ahead this passage of Pesachim.
Oh, yeah.
Talmud.
Yeah. Okay.
It's crazy. Like, what does it have to do with anything?
That's my question too.
You mean why did I add it? Because I had extra space on the page. I didn't want it to go to waste. No.
Okay. Oh, well, that's a good. Okay.
That's not the reason. The reason. So let's just take a look at that quickly. Sasha, does he need to come inside? Huh? You can come inside. Yeah. Okay. So we take a look at it from the Babylonian Talmud, right? With regard to the prominent priests and those like them, Abba Shaul ben Batnit, 1st century, said in the name of Abba Yosef ben Chanin, "Woe is me due to the house of Baitos." The house of Baitos were famous priests, a priestly family. Woe is me to their clubs, meaning they're hanging out with others in an aristocratic sense. Woe is me to the house of Chanin. Woe is me to their whispers, because they are great political priestly leaders, but they speak lashon hara. They're gossipers. Woe is me to the house of Katros. Woe is me due to their pens. They write all sorts of things, perhaps letters to the Romans and things like that. Woe is me to the house of Ishmael ben Palchi. Woe is me due to their fists, because they're violent. right? It was that their fathers were high priests and their sons were the temple treasurers and their sons-in-laws were the temple overseers and the servants strike the people with clubs. Meaning, in this rabbinic passage here, reflecting those centuries through Pharisaic eyes, they're all corrupt. They're all rotten, right? So I see this as background to Paul speaking, and this also influenced me to say what I said about Paul and Ananias, or Hananiah would be his Hebrew name. Hananiah, the chief priest, maybe the same as Hanin in the passages of Psachim as well, in seeing him as not serious. In other words, that's not a real leader. They're corrupt. They do all those things. That's who they are. That's why I brought this passage, Harold. Anything else?
Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And I agree absolutely. All right, folks, we'll see each other. When is the next meeting?
Next Thursday, right? And then we break for Passover and Holy Week.
Yep. Okay, then. Be well, everybody. Thank you.